Unfortunately, Iraq was not a perfect stabilization case. We've learned a lot from that. I think that's an understatement. I heard some laugh there. But if we go in, we have to consider the disarmament. The longer it takes, the more likely that weapons will flow, the more likely that an insurgency has time to really establish itself and arm themselves. We have to break down the military, and after that, we have to figure out how to reintegrate them into society in a way that's beneficial to the future North Korean state. And for us to pull this off, some estimates, this is a figure thrown out by the Broad Institute. We'll need about 13 soldiers for every 1,000 civilians. And that puts a projection at 325,000 soldiers total required. To put that in perspective, the United States operation in Iraq peaked out at 180,000. So this is about twice that. And the process will basically be a series of leapfrogging operations where we seize one tier, stabilize, set up some bases, move on to the next tier. And this is going to take some time to pull off as well, especially if the United States is just doing it by itself. The terrain is not easy to navigate, it's very rugged. So that's roughly giving you an idea of what the picture is going to look like in North Korea. All right, so I'm throwing a lot of information at you right now. And what all this should tell you is that this is not going to be easy. It's going to be a lot of resources, and the most important part is we need cooperation from China. Without China's support, this is not going to work out. Now, the tough part is how do we actually talk to China about this? There are political sensitivities. Imagine a scenario where we actually step in and say to China, as the United States, let's talk about North Korean collapse. How do we make this happen? Who are the agents that should be involved? Should it be at the head of state level, or should it be at the mid-tier diplomat level? And a good way to frame all this is to think about the differences in the positions that they've taken publicly and what their genuine interests are. There's a lot of things that can be floating around in this consideration. So think about the interests first of all. Think about what sort of concessions that China might try to extract from the United States to proceed with this sort of negotiation. And then he talks about a joint contingency plan really is a negotiation at its heart. Who should be involved? Should it be generals, president, academics? Should we try track 2 diplomacy, or should we stick with track 1? What channels? Do we try to keep this covert? Should be very public? What might happen in that case if it becomes public? So right now we're talking about North Korea, China, and the United States, but we have to think about the big picture. What's going on in Taiwan as we talk about this? What's going on over disputed territories? To try to use this opportunity as a point of leverage. And what are the costs? What's this going to cost us in political capital? So these are all things we have to think about as we proceed with this sort of exercise. And we were going to make this more of an engaged role-playing game, but just in the interest of time, we're going to cut that out for now. But is this even possible? I think it might be. This is a quote taken from the Congressional Research Service, and they kind of alluded to the possibility that this has been discussed before. The details, not quite as clear, but it's likely that this has been brought up at some point. And these are some excellent readings if you are interested in exploring this area further. One of the authors here is actually a father of Fletcher student, so that might be an interesting thing for some Fletcher students to pick at. But that's it for me. Do you have any questions? But hopefully that was entertaining at the very least. Thank you.
Yeah, go
please.
That's Great Rasmussen from the Research Institute. Two questions. One was you talked as if the awareness that there was regime collapse just happened. So one day it's okay, and then there's regime collapse, and then something else happens. But in fact, that period before regime collapse was because of bleeding of nuclear material. But the second and more important point is the Chinese government would be dead opposed to American support for the border. What's the role of the South Korean troops for the border? to say American commandos. Does the United States have 70,000 commandos? I don't know if it does have them. But using all of them. But so what's the relative role of South Korean forces and American forces? South Korean forces would be more acceptable to that whole Korean.
True. This is a very idealized model, and what this tells us is like even in the best case scenario, it's a huge burden. Ideally, we would pull in South Korean forces. There's also a lot of reservation in South Korea about actually going into North Korea. They're concerned about we're concerned about the cost, we're concerned about the logistical implications, we're concerned about the political implications, and for the South Korean end of things, that's also a consideration as well. Ideally, if the United States intervenes in this case, we would share the burden with South Korea. I think that's a given in that case.
We'll go for it.
Hi, thank you for your wonderful presentation. So I have one question about how to achieve the stabilization. You just mentioned about how 1 million soldiers might be needed for the stabilization. But in terms of like political structure, do you see them as being more of like China-U.S. or maybe political initiative, like joining into North Korean issue, or do you see it as more of like U.S. military or even Arab military-led kind of government as you saw from like 1945 to 1948 in South Korea? What kind of system would be imposed in North Korea if you were to see North Korea collapse?
So the 1945 through 48 model, that didn't work out too well for the United States with General Hodge. How would it work out? That's tough to say. One idea is to send this off to the United Nations and allow North Korea to decide on its own. But we tried that with the Korean Peninsula as a whole towards the end of the 40s, and that solidified the division and actually made the situation worse. So is the United Nations the best way to pull this off? Possibly. Most likely, we could expect that China is going to want to have a big say in the matter. And they probably will, just because if anything does happen, they'll be the first to figure this out. They have the diplomatic connections to North Korea, they have economic connections, military connections. So whatever develops afterwards, I would speculate that it's going to be heavily shaped by the Chinese political leadership.
I think we're going to keep moving. Thanks again. All right. Next up is Andrew Tapper. He's a PhD candidate at Tufts Fletcher School, and his general interests are international relations theory, security studies in the Asia-Pacific region. Today he's going to be talking to us about China's strategy in territorial conflict since 2000. All right, I'd like to invite him. So my presentation will be a lot shorter, so I'll let you guys go ahead and enjoy the next one. This is a big interest of mine, what's China's strategy toward particularly its maritime disputes in the East and the South China Seas. I think it's useful to have a little bit of background. China, because of its geography, is bordered by 14 states, I think most of which it's had territorial disputes with since at least 1949. A lot of people don't realize that China has struck a pretty compromising posture towards a lot of its disputes. According to Frabel Statistics, who's a well-respected scholar on this, 17 out of 23 disputes China has compromised or at least ceded a portion of its territory on. And in particular, we see this kind of compromising trend over the last couple of decades. Since 1991, over half of these 17 settlements have occurred. And then early in the 21st century, we saw a kind of a remarkable shift in Chinese diplomacy. People talked about Chinese new security concept, China's new diplomacy. For the first time, we see willingness for China to engage in these very sensitive sovereignty disputes in multilateral fora, which previously had been very kind of opposed to doing. It still is very reluctant to do so. And so in 2002, we see that China and ASEAN concluded the Declaration on the Code of Conduct, which is not a code of conduct, but it's a declaration that they'll consider a code of conduct in the future. But this was really kind of a seminal event, even though it's relatively toothless. There's a lot of symbolic significance, and it's a seminal issue in the South China Sea. And by the way, I should have prefaced this. Nothing here is going to be dealing with the East China Sea or any of the continental disputes. There's just too much there. It would be very unwieldy. So this is only going to be about the South China Sea, which has enough to keep us occupied, I think. Although we see in 2006, just as a piece of background, there was a lot of conciliatory talk between Beijing and Tokyo regarding the Senkakus and the Diaoyutai. And since 2007, 2008, it's just been a very different story. And this is a timeline that this is a really small snapshot of kind of these back and forth tit for tat escalatory sorts of conduct between ASEAN states and China. Some of it involves submissions to UN Commission on extended continental shelf. A lot of it is kind of very low intensity uses of force, like ramming ships and cutting survey tows. And then a lot of this kind of this sorts of culminates, in my view, in 2012 with the Scarborough Shoal. Are you guys familiar with Scarborough Shoal? Okay, so this is a disputed piece of territory. It's an atoll. It's tiny in the middle of the South China Sea. I believe it falls within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, but it also falls within China's 9-dash line, which encompasses about 80–90% of the maritime space in the South China Sea. So there were, to make a long story and a complicated story very, very short, some Chinese fishermen were arrested, or they were attempted to be arrested by a Philippine Coast Guard ship. The Coast Guard ship was incidentally their flagship Navy vessel. Sorry, it wasn't a Coast Guard ship; it was a Navy vessel actually, and that's significant because there's an escalatory kind of context built in there. And this was sold to the Philippines from the U.S. and it's about a 30-year-old Coast Guard cutter. So it gives you a sense of at least the hardware that the Philippines were working with. So when this Coast Guard ship, the Navy ship was sent in to arrest these Chinese fishermen who were fishing in the atoll. There's a cycle of escalation starts. Chinese paramilitary or basically like Coast Guard ships are sent in, and there's a standoff that lasts for a number of weeks, if not months. The U.S. tries to mediate the dispute. The mediation ends up falling apart, and at the end of about 4 or 5 weeks, maybe even more, de facto control over this shoal is transferred from the Philippines to China, and this is the way it is today. So this is, I think this is a real seminal event. And a lot of the tactics people call them salami slicing or whatever you want to call it, very low intensity, very not using military assets, using Coast Guard vessels. We see the same kind of stuff in the East China Sea today. So, I thought this was going to be a discussion. I think the really important issues to discuss here is how do we understand this shift? Have Chinese objectives changed? Is this just a manifestation of an unfolding security dilemma in maritime East Asia, and maybe even East Asia more broadly? Or are the objectives the same, and maybe it's just pursuing its objectives differently? And then if we really wanted to get into it, we would ask, why, what explains this shift? And if we have time later, these are really pithy questions that some of my research deals with, and I'd love to discuss with you guys. So do we take questions now? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Questions. So if you want to discuss it briefly on any of these points.
Well, do you guys have any thoughts?
Question.
Yeah.
So I heard, I think once, but I want to start with you, that I think most of the heating up of the South China Sea happened after, I think there was a provision in UNCLOS, the Nations Convention about the Sea, that after rectifying or exceeding after several specific number of years, that you have to submit your, I think, continental shelf claims. And that happened for China in 2011, and then that was what really triggered by other countries to also say, well, you're claiming this, we're also claiming that, and can you maybe elaborate whether that's actually the case? And
yeah, so in terms of triggers to this, I mean, I'm presenting this as kind of like a black and white shift, and in practice, I don't think it's like that. I think it's been more gradual. And I picked 2007, 2008 because it's a lot of people point to 2008 as kind of this point of departure where Chinese conduct began to shift. And I think in practice, these things were kind of brewing, and they had. I mean, even in the 20th century, there were armed conflicts in the South China Sea. So way more. The level of escalation was already much higher. I think in terms of the continental shelf, I think it certainly matters. I think every time if you look at a timeline like this, every time you see a claimant state make a submission, that's a tit that is normally responded to with a tap from another side. I would have a problem saying that underlying this whole dispute is access to the continental shelf. I think it's important. I think EEZ rights are important, but I'm inclined to see really a strategic element in control of the South China Sea and in claims of sovereignty over the land features that really far surpasses the economic value. There's oil and gas is speculated to be under the sea, and the speculation on it varies dramatically. So. I think it's an issue. I think it's an important issue. Although I would be really reluctant to say it's like the central animating factor.
Could you just perhaps take a few sentences to tell us what your main hypothesis is for your PhD?
Yeah, sure. I think the strategy has. I think there's probably more continuity than there is change. I think the strategy, really, the big thing that I see is that responses to what are perceived to be infringements or escalations from ASEAN states, the responses are more heavy-handed, which is in some sense understandable. China since 2000, since the 90s, has grown in power over a dramatic fashion. We should expect to see that they pursue their interests, particularly core interests that deal with sovereignty and territorial integrity, with greater vigor. But I think it's very problematic, particularly in the South China Sea, because in the East China Sea you have a long-standing rivalry with Japan. There's very little to me that suggests that the historical issues, the nationalism is going away anytime soon. But in Southeast Asia, in the beginning of this century, we saw probably China-ASEAN relations at their best, and I think what's so telling to me is that this large reserve of goodwill that China built up over the first part of the century has, since about this time, 2007, 2008, largely been bankrupted. And that, I think, is very telling, because it's just the outcome is so remarkable. And the costs to China, I think, have been really severe. And that it's telling to me that if they're willing to incur those kind of costs, that they're definitely willing to incur costs like that in the East China Sea, where the nationalism is greater, and it also points to me that China, the evolution of China, if Chinese trajectory continues to and they continue to have economic expansion and military buildup, I would expect to see more of what you see in the South China Sea, because it just seems to me to be it seems to be very telling that they're willing to bankrupt these kind of friendships they have. And China doesn't have very many friendships. It's kind of an allied and proud state that, with respect to other states, who knows?
It's interesting.
Just check it out.
No, but you can take a question at a good time. Do you have a question?
I have a quick question. In terms of the role of public opinion within China, because like nationalism, I'm thinking most recently of the Malaysian airline tragedy, where the relatives in China have been very vocal and very assertive. Everybody's criticizing the Malaysian authorities, but they're doing it by protesting in front of the Malaysian embassy, and Chinese press has, not to be seen as showing behind public opinion, has also been very vocal, say that. In criticizing Malaysia, so much so that it really is upset the Malaysian government.
Yeah.
And many things, including, other people got on the plane, Malaysians got on the plane, why only China was complaining. And then the government realized the problem that we're talking about in terms of Malaysians, they want to have a good relationship with Malaysia, and absolutely speaking Malaysia right. So Chinese authorities, the foreign ministry and elsewhere, ambassadors, Malaysia, gave briefings to Malaysian reporters, basically saying that they don't represent China, these people are extremists, they're relatives, and so on. You never dare do that to the Chinese reporters directly. So they're trying to walk a very thin line. On the one hand, they want to back the relatives of public opinion to show that they're just nationalistic as people. At the same time, they don't want to upset the Malaysians. And you see also with some of the stuff that's related with trying to find the black box, where they do publicly criticized the New York Times, a lot of other publications, as well as by the Malaysian government, and sending out all these false signals, not even using their, for a lot of reasons, the Xiaowei sources and so on, because they have command control problems, as Rusty talked about earlier. So how do you see this playing out? They're kind of building up a situation where they're becoming more assertive, and therefore people in China are expecting them to become more assertive. Everybody in the Chinese press is comparing China to Putin, saying Putin's #1 man in the world. Everybody takes attention to Russia now. China's supposed to be the second most important country in the world. Why aren't we doing it? So this cycle of nationalism and public opinion is pushing it to become a way. At the same time, they have contrasting interests in keeping good relations. How do you see that playing out as China's power increases and the role of public opinion?
Yeah, this is a difficult question, and it's not clear to me. It's not clear to me that I buy the premise, really, that nationalism and public opinion drives foreign policy. Yeah, or is it? Yeah. I think in the Malaysian incident, I think it's a little different. I think it's understandable. I mean, China wants to build up basically consular services. And you saw that in the evacuation of Tripoli. And this is a point of pride. It's something that they haven't done, and they believe great powers should do, like the U.S. does. And they're increasingly doing it. And I think they do it well. And I think that is really how I would frame the Malaysian airliner. Nationalism for the territorial disputes is is a big one. It's a big question, and I don't know. There's really varying hypotheses on the role of nationalism, and I don't feel qualified to really discuss it. But you know, after the nationalization of the Senkakus, we saw violent protests break out in Beijing, right? And these protests were certainly sanctioned to some degree by the party, but they also dissipated pretty much when they're supposed to dissipate. And I think that's kind of telling. I mean, if nationalism is really this unbridled force that the party has to struggle with, and it might be a force that could even present a threat to the party one day, they seem to handle it very, very well, almost too well for me to really be convinced of the hypothesis. But again, I'm not an expert on Chinese nationalism, so I don't know.
That's James Riley's view in Strong Society, Smart State, basically more.
Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes to go, about 15. But so the last breakout leader who will be presenting today is Yobom Mangshang, and he's from Burma. He's an ethnic Kachin, and he has worked with grassroots communities to organize and empower underserved people through community civic education training in Kachin State. And he's currently a graduate candidate for a Masters of Arts in Law and Diplomacy at Tufts Fletcher, and he's going to be presenting today on Burma's ethnic and political landscape, specifically China's relationship with the Kachin Independence Organization. So welcome him up.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for the time to come to the talk. And I prepare my presentations as an introduction for people who are new to Burma, and I'm sure some of you have already have depth knowledge about Burma, and some may not. So just bear with me. And I'd like to start with a little bit of background with the ethnic makeup in Burma. Burma's independence in 1948, which, as you can see in the picture, like different sections in the border regions are occupied by the different minority groups. And when independence start, it's almost as soon as the independence start, civil war broke out. The main reason of the civil war broke out was what academics define term as Burmanizations. In a Burmanizations, how this happen is is a structural, systematic discriminations. For example, if you are not Buddhist, if you are not Burman majority, you are, regardless of intelligence, your intelligence, you are not qualified to go to police academy. You are not qualified to go to high technical professional schools such as military academies, and you are not you are certainly will not be promoted in the civil service, for example. So that kind of discriminations right from the quite early on. And as Burma's plagued with this complexity of ethnic politics and history divided up by the colonies, British colonies, and in the outside world, I think from my knowledge, almost all the, at least most of the books that I have came across that written on Burma, and most of the newspaper media that I have looked at that is written on Burma, is almost all of them say something like Burmese ethnic armed groups are fighting for greater autonomy. And I think this greater autonomy, in my opinion, I think is somewhat misleading. And it suggests that there is already some kind of autonomies out there, and which is absolutely not the case. And so this kind of misrepresentation is only serve the Burmese government that get the credits which is not due. As a result, better or worse, being a minority, I think is like unlucky that at all these high politics, minority groups are just ignored and continue to suffer. You will see from time to time from the governments, Burmese government, all of these ethnic armed groups, different ethnic armed groups are fighting because they are more to establish as a warlord, not interested in not interested in peace, and this kind of argument you will hear from time to time. But it's not the case. This is just for the one of the example that the KIO, Kachin Independent Organization, had several talks with the government from the very early on, and the most recent one was this early this month. 21 armed groups and the governments met in Rangoon, and guess what? Failed. And but what you hear in the American news, for example, in the West, is that the things in government is having a peace and have the ceasefire agreements and peace process going on, and the war just in the last meeting in Rangoon, less than 48 hours is a bombshell and start already. Even yesterday was fighting, and in the most recent round of fighting, like 3,000 refugees are displaced, and so one of the reasons why all these talks have failed is obviously in that the armed groups have very little leverage that to enter in the negotiation. And we learned that in a theory of negotiation, practically, unless you have some kind of leverage, you are not likely to get to be able to negotiate what you want. As we know, the government, as a government enjoy the sovereignty in a diplomatic coverage, monopoly of the armed force, monopoly of the resources. The government has all, but because of this unbalanced position, the government has no intention of sharing political power with the minority groups. And so as a Burma, one of the frontier China, China is today the biggest investor in Burma, and as you can see, the mineral resource extractions, China is all over the place, and logging totally monopolized in Burma. If you read in 2003 Global Witness reports, is basically almost all of the woods from Burma going to China. mining, virtually China has a complete monopoly, and hydropower projects, and all of these projects are Chinese project. This is only in the Chin State, but also in Chin State, also there are so many hydropower projects that China has. And a gas pipeline, as you can see. So it's not just investment, but the economy is basically monopoly in Burma. And so I like to talk a little bit about the relationship between how China is actually using or have the relationship with non-state armed groups. As an example, I'd like to give with Kachin Independent Organization, KIO. I like to divide like 3 stages from early or from independent to 80s. Is you can say a little bit about maybe can characterize as maybe like active or if not active, then at least sympathize. Chinese sympathize toward non-state armed group in these periods. Chinese especially supported Communist Party of Burma. Basically, every supplies, all the supplies, Red Guards from the volunteer from China come to Burma, and one of the reasons even I think the Communist Party of Burma revolution fell in Burma, communist revolution fell in Burma, because in the Chinese not only supply arms but volunteer. This volunteer foreigner is Burmese government is very smart with the propaganda. Look, China is invading, and you can see local people, because of the local people see that actually Chinese person is there with the communist armed group. This one does not see as a equality or socialist agenda, but is invasion. So that is one of the, in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why Communist Party of Burma fell in insurgency in Burma. And through KIO does not have the KIO and Chinese is almost like a one-sided love or expectations. As a border with Kachin people are also recognized one of the official minority group in China. In China, Kachin people are known as Qingpo. And so being a shared border with China, being the population is divided in 2 countries, whether you like it or not, you have to deal with it. So as a neighbor, KIO, from what I talked with the leaderships, they always expect that Chinese authority more sympathize toward them. But so far, Chinese government has not shown much of the sympathies that the rebel groups are looking for. In these first periods, KIA received some assistance through Communist Party of Burma. Then a second phase from 80 to 2011 is I think is the lowest time. In 1979, 80s, when Deng Xiaoping came to power, the Chinese government basically cut off the supplies to the Communist Party of Burma, and then begin to engage economically with the governments. And so this is the lowest time that with the rebel groups. And in the first image, you see the different ethnic groups are in the border area. this logging, mining, and all these resource extraction activities are taking place in the ethnic area. And the rebel groups, you can do very, very little. You just watch that the natural resources are drifted away in front of your eyes into China. You have almost nothing to say. And so this, I think, from time to time frustrate the rebel leaders. And the leaders that I have talked to mentioned that whenever they meet in these periods, whenever they talk to the Chinese business people, government officials, the business people, the Chinese government official, seems to have a very little or no regard for the rebel groups. And from the tone that they have talked, it's almost as if they are saying that this is just a rebel group and one day will disappear. So it's better to have relationship with the governments. So this kind of relationship in these periods. And in the most recent talk, it's almost like complicit with the attack on the rebel groups. And in May, right now the current government, things in government came into power officially in March 2011. And in May, the new Min Online is chief of staff in Burma, and the new chief of staff went to Beijing. And then the border security issue is, as in the North Korean presentation, we hear Chinese interests, border security and stability. And they talk about border security issue in the border. And in the same month, Burmese electricity minister also met Chinese official as well as China Corporation, which involved so many of the hydropower project in Burma. And in the news, they also said the Chinese company is grateful for the Burmese government's support for the Chinese investment. And in June, less than a month, to be exact, June 9 is already a broke-out civil war. So it's very believable, is it, that there will be instability in the regions. The Chinese government is almost like informed what will be happening in the next few days. And then before the war actually starts, one of the Taiping River Chinese workers, engineers are like a hijack or taken over by the Burmese government. And in the local news, it's reported as a Burmese government soldiers hijacked Chinese workers. I mean, there's no reason to hijack. Just it's merely evacuations for the workers. And then, recently, the Chinese government begin to be interested from the lowest, no interest to interest. The events that may have sparked Chinese interest to have interest in KIOs is, I think, it's worth mentioning that Burma's warming relationship with the West, especially the US, is one of the events. And in May 2012, KIO write a letter to United Nations and asking that to be to come and facilitate or to be witness as in Burma's peace process. And this is, of course, the presence of UK and US requested by the KIO was, of course, rejected by the Chinese. So eventually, they only come to agree with the UN representative. And another event is the flow of refugees into China. China doesn't want refugee to flow into China. In 2012, I have traveled almost all of the refugee camps along the border, and even though the Chinese government did not deny that they forcefully forced back the refugee, but they did force back the refugees. And in this last year, on January 10, Kachin people from China, about 1,000 marched to Raida, which is right next to KIO headquarters area. But the Chinese government blocked these people from crossing Burma border, and we learned that these events in China is actually later authority investigated who organized these trips, this march, and how this happens. Even though they did not make any punishments, and so these things I think the some of the events that at least I can think of interest China's interest relation with the KIO, and China's motivation relation is often reported as to signal Burma that you cannot be too cozy with the U.S. relationship. Otherwise, I will arm with the rebel groups, almost like this. And then China does not have interest that Kachin conflict with international lives. So when the Kachin conflicts become too internationalized, is almost we know that the Chinese government have been always blocking the UN resolution against Burma. So it is too obvious. Then it's difficult to block to protect internationally. So that's not what the Kachin conflict to be internationalized. And another one is, as Ying Zhu pointed out, actually I kind of suspicious about the last point. If China actually really has this point, but anyway, this is often people pointed out. And so, by and large, in Burma, the armed groups are not just with the KIA, and armed group is used as a bargaining chip in Burma for China's interests. And another one, KIO is right now reported as a second largest armed groups that is still fighting with the war. And the most one, you will see the United States or United War State Army, which is the best arm supplied by the Chinese. And this is the block, right? Oh, sorry. Yeah. And the warming up relationship, KIA receive eggs, and official. Right now, the Chinese government relaxed a little bit trouble for the rebel leaders and the refugee from the recent fight. And so I like to throw here with a not almost, it's like a not, you might think that naive or provocative. I think in Burma for the long term, to have a stable rebel groups has to have provided with some kind of leverage in order to negotiate with the Burmese governments. And I'm not saying here the rebel groups, that sometimes when we talk about rebel groups, it's almost like bad guys. But the rebel groups, in 2013, the most respected person and the person of the year is actually the rebel leaders. So if we think human right, democracy value a little bit, then they are it's perfectly makes sense to support them. And border, unless there is in all this Kala border region is actively rebel control area. So if there is no stability, then border trade would be affected. Border trade would be affected. It's already shown. So that comes to my end of the presentation, and if you want to continue for learn more about Burma, then I think Bartolina and Martin Smith is a great book on Burma's ethnic conflict. And thank you very much.
Quick thank you to all of the leaders who came and discussed with us today. Really interesting. At this point, we're going to do a 5-minute break and then continue after. Please down here. We're staying here.
Yeah, so the next panel is in this room. And that'll be in about 5 minutes. So.
Yes. He has videos, right? No one ever do that.
Each year, 95% of homeowners will have a claim. But if you do,
but I'm going to do an African
Yeah, we'll toss it out. Don't put it out.
It's not stuck yet. Great.
Yeah, I walked in.
Okay. Great. So like the line graph there to
I wouldn't
like patient ritual.
Oh, really? Oh. Because I saw you up there. I know. We stopped. I know. We stopped and we were and like. I know. All of us together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can't believe my grandma.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was
叫哦，对对对，
哦，是阿福的
是家的，
是家福号。
是吃。你换眼镜了，不然我肯定。
哦，换眼镜。
好多人到这边来了。
我是好像没见正好有那个。
是 Harvard 那个
Harvard 那个我挺爱学 Harvard 那个。
为什么？官方的。
对，然后而且就我听那个老师他们讲，我特别喜欢。
我是上次我在 Harvard 听过他讲一个很 private 的话，就是中国老师那种人，他那个讲的就是他自己人生的一些经历啊、感悟啊，决定太贵了，这有一个学生头。
Yeah, he's now.
Because I know John Shirley, runner at the Animal Central Production, and I agree with
I know.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tara, and I'm here at Tufts in computer science. So it's my great honor to be moderating the final panel for the China-U.S. Symposium, titled Foreign Media Perceptions. Throughout history, the international community has understood China through various mediums. In the 14th century, the word-of-mouth tales and the travels of Marco Polo described China as a land of immense wealth and vast waterways. In the 19th century, the American Protestant missionary descriptions of China are of a land of destitution and deprivation. In the 21st century, the mass cinematic television and print media often inform the Western understanding of China. In the 2012 presidential debates, former Governor Mitt Romney repeatedly described China as a country to be cracked down upon. In doing so, he broadcasted an image of a China to be feared and confronted to the 70 million viewers that viewed the debates on television, as well as the many others that viewed it through Twitter and various social media. Yet, just as we now question Marco Polo's tales, it is also worth questioning our own story of China, captured in headlines and political rhetoric. Foreign perceptions of China impact the country's soft power and its political leverage in the international community. This panel explores how foreign perceptions affect soft power. It also explores how these perceptions are formed by the media by looking at Hollywood films, journalism, digital media, print media, social media. It challenges us to look beyond Marco Polo and Mitt Romney to reevaluate what our individual perceptions of China are and how these perceptions are developed. As Terry Louds, a former scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, said, Americans no longer have a choice of accepting or rejecting engagement with China. They do have the option of seeing China more clearly, with fewer illusions, based on a dispassionate assessment of the past and future needs. Thus, we begin this panel to assess foreign media perceptions, how these perceptions are informed by the mass media, and how they affect China's soft power. Each panelist will speak for 15 minutes, after which we will ask the panelists to comment on one another's talks if they wish to, and give concluding remarks, followed by a Q&A session. So we will now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Stanley Rosen. Dr. Rosen is a professor of political science at USC, specializing in Chinese politics and society. He studied Chinese in Taiwan and Hong Kong and has traveled to mainland China 40 times in the last 30 years. Oh, 50 times. He is the author and editor of 8 books. More now? Okay. And he has written on such topics as the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese legal system, public opinion, youth, gender, human rights, and film and the media. He is the co-editor of Chinese Education and Society and a frequent guest editor of other translation journals. His most recent books include Chinese Politics, State, Society, and Markets, and Art, Politics, and Commerce in Chinese Cinema, and the co-editor of that book is also here with us today. So with that, Dr. Rosen.
Okay, thanks very much. What I'm talking about is changing images of China and Chinese in American film and TV, and I've cut down the DVD. I'm going to show most of it's a DVD. It's just over 12 minutes. Originally it was over an hour, so after ruthless cutting to get it into enough time, I've left out a lot of things. I could show season 2 House of Cards episodes, trying to play a big part in that, and lots of other things. So I've ended up with brief clips from 6 films and 4 TV shows, and the attempt is to show the change in images. And I start with 16 Candles. So most of you are too young to have seen that. It came out in 1984. It introduced, though, a very enduring and influential Chinese character named Long Duck Dong. Has anybody heard of Long Duck Dong? Yeah. Somebody a little older. Now, Long Duck Dong made life miserable for young Asian American males at that time, and you'll see why. The second clip is from Date Night, Steve Carell movie, and Tina Fey from 2010, which shows how the character Long Duck Dong is still being referenced in movies today. Now, Long Duck Dong, you'll see, even in the brief clip, is an asexual nerd. He's laughable. He's also played by a Japanese actor, which a lot of people don't know necessarily. But if you had an exchange student, he's an exchange student from China. If you had an exchange student today from China, it would reflect the rise of China. So a student would be a whiz at school. He'd be very proud of China's achievements, highly patriotic. You probably wouldn't have that student stealing intellectual property because you want to not upset the Chinese today. In those days, in '84, they didn't care. Now, one of the clips is from a movie, 21 and Over. I don't know if anybody's seen that. And then you see a certain evolution in 21 and Over based on the influence of the China market. And that film was directed by the screenwriters of a movie called The Hangover. I don't know how you've seen it, so you can imagine the kind of film it is. The American version of the film is very raunchy. I apologize if anybody doesn't like the word F-U-C-K. There's a lot of it in this clip and in this film, these clips I show. But the American version is very raunchy. And the reason I have the clip here is to compare. I'm not going to show the Chinese edition of this film, which is being prepared, but there's a difference between the American version of this 21 and Over and the Chinese version, which was recut by the same people for a release in China. The American version that I'll show, again, a brief clip, shows a Chinese-American college student who gets totally wasted throughout the movie, engages in very outrageous behavior, which I can't show in any audience. And in the end, he tells his traditional tiger father, no, I don't want to go to medical school, and have a very nasty breakup. By contrast, the Chinese version is very different, particularly the beginning and the ending. The Chinese version is about a young exchange student who starts off in China, leaves China to go to the U.S., but gets corrupted in the United States by all this hedonistic partying, fraternity partying, and so on at American universities. So he later goes back to China as a much better person, re-embracing his roots, realizing how corrupt America is. So completely different films, 2 different messages for 2 markets. I also have clips from film 2012, which I've shortened, and Looper, to show how Hollywood blockbuster films have to have China-friendly scenes because of the growth of the Chinese market, which will be larger than the North American market by 2017, 2018 or so. And Hollywood blockbusters make about 70% of their money overseas. Now, films like Looper and Iron Man 3 contain additional scenes just for the China market, and a lot more can be said about that, which are not shown in the international version. At the same time, I show Men in Black 3, just a very brief clip. You look at a film like that, or a recent Pirates of the Caribbean, where China, in fact, was a smuggler in Singapore. These films contain scenes the Chinese authorities don't like, so they're eliminated when they're shown in China, and they still can be shown in China, minus those scenes. So the scene I'm showing for Men in Black 3 is part of a longer scene in Chinatown in New York. And that whole Chinatown sequence was cut out when it was shown in China. More extreme case, I'm not showing, one of the things I had to cut down was Red Dawn, the film which was originally having the Chinese as the bad guys, later, at a cost of more than $1 million, they digitized everything, so the bad guys are now North Koreans. Because someone said, do you realize there's a market in China? You want to eliminate that market. But I cut out all those Red Dawn clips. Finally, 4 TV shows I've left in: Family Guy, The Simpsons, South Park, The Daily Show. And one of the messages I would suggest, as I conclude, is that TV shows such as those, which are generally not shown on Chinese TV, anybody who wants them can easily get them downloaded for free. Everything is available in China, even if it's not available on home video in the US. So they're widely available in Daban or pirated versions in China. But these TV shows can be much more critical of China because they're not really selling them necessarily to China than the films. So let me stop there. And I have to dim the lights, I think.
Yeah.
There are no subtitles on these because Red Dawn is going to eliminate them. Yeah.
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 Can't believe my grandmother actually felt me up.
What's happening, hot stuff?
His name is Long Duck Dong. Long Duck Dong. He came down with Grandma and Grandpa Baker. He's an exchange student that's living with them.
Well, he's totally resolved.
He is not. He is a very sweet boy.
Just opened boiler sheets and mattresses after these.
I don't suppose it makes any difference to you, but there's a very weird Chinese guy up in Mike's room. Do you think that there's any reason I should possibly stay home tonight?
Well, I think it might be nice if you visit with your grandparents and Long Duck Dong.
Who?
The weird Chinese guy in Mike's room.
Very clever dinner. Appetizing food fit neatly into interesting round pie.
It's a quiche.
How do you spell?
Well, you don't spell it, son. You eat it.
Sam, you two should have a lot to chat about.
I love visiting with the grandma and the grandpa and writing letters to parents and pushing lawn mowing machines so grandpa's hyena don't get disturbed.
Hernia!
Oh, yes, indeed. He does the dishes and helps with the laundry, you betcha.
Would you like to go to the dance with Sam?
It's like that Asian dude in 16 Candles, Long Dick Dog? Long Duck Dong. Long Duck Dong, that dude. Getty Watanabe. That's him. He can't play. No matter how hard he tries, he can't play a doctor. Oh, yeah. No, it'd be like, why does Long Duck Dong dress up like a doctor?
Welcome to the People Republic of China.
We're good to be here. Say hi, kids.
Leave it to the Chinese. I didn't think it was possible. Not in the time we had.
You're going to get out, you're going to go overseas, right? Studying up your Mandarin?
French.
French? Why the fuck French?
I'm going to France.
You should go to China.
I'm going to France.
I'm from the future. You should go to China.
I'm going to France. You gonna tell me how to be learning Mandarin?
Okay, Jay, so happy to see you. Mr. Wu can give you a regular table. You know hungry?
Show us the tanks, Wu.
Oh, sure. You look very fresh.
Show us the tanks in the back.
So sorry, no speaking English. You come back later, okay?
Save the chopsocky bullshit for the tourists, Wu.
Hey, what you guys want to bust my balls for, huh?
You don't have no balls, Wu. Ooh, man. You look like you come from the planet. Damn.
And Bob here is a clear violation of Health Ordinance 32. Selling unlicensed extraterrestrial foodstuffs.
That is an earth fish. Very traditional in China. You arrest me, that's a hate crime.
It would be if you were Chinese.
The hell is going on here?
Oh, shit.
Who the fuck is this guy?
Hey,
I'm Jeffrey's father. Who the fuck are you?
I'm Randy. He's Randy. That's Randy.
Okay, Randy. I'm here to take my son to his interview.
Yo, he's not going with you, so why don't you just get the fuck out of here?
Oh, no. He's definitely coming with me.
Oh, shit. Look, old man, don't make me beat you in front of your son. I wouldn't do that. Oh, shit! Oh, that's what fucking happens, man.
Oh, you got to take. Oh, man.
You should probably stay down.
Let's go.
Okay, you need to tell me you don't want to be a doctor right now.
I don't play skis. I was tell him.
No, you tell him. No, you fucking tell him. You fucking tell him. You fucking tell him. I am
Let's go, Jeffrey.
No, I'm not going.
What the hell are you talking about?
I don't want to go to med school. I don't want to be a doctor. I'm not a kid anymore, Dad. I'm 21 years old. And from here on out, I'm going to decide what I do with my life, and that's that.
Okay. I get it.
See, I told you you'd understand.
I get it. You're even dumber than I thought.
Get in the goddamn car, Jeffrey.
No.
You ungrateful little shit.
Dad.
I can't believe I raised a worthless piece of shit like you.
Dude, what?
That's my friend.
Miller.
That's my friend, dude.
Miller, calm down.
Well, if we're gonna hide out here in Asian Town, we have to find a place to live.
Yes, and we should do nothing to draw attention to ourselves as outsiders. Oh my God, it's Jackie Chan! Oh my God, it's Jackie Chan! Oh my God, it's Jackie Chan! Hi there, always nice to meet a fan of my movies. Oh my God, you're Ethan Hawke! No, I'm not. Sorry, my mistake. Oh my God, it's Ethan Hawke!
Mom, can we go get some food?
Oh my God, it's Malcolm in the Middle!
I'm not a boy.
Yes, you are.
I can't believe we have to live here.
This sucks. Tell me about it. I haven't seen one female baby since we got here. This place is a sausage fest. Oh, damn. I say, I seem to have sewn a shoe to my hand. May I go to the nurse? Replace him! Ah!
Very good. You have passport, husbands. All we need now is the sack of 10,000 happinesses.
Look at him sleeping. He's like a little angel that killed 50 million people. Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Lisa, soon you will have a Chinese baby sister who will surpass you academically.
I don't know about that. I'm considered pretty smart.
Well, Tibet was considered pretty independent. How'd that go?
Why is that brutal?
Regret to inform you that our final stunt will not be performed. Our star acrobat had an onset of outspokenness and suffered a bullet-related death. This is most disillusioning.
It seems our leaders are not all-knowing.
Now I will question everything. Why doesn't Perozam ever come here?
We need your acrobatic skills. Only you can prevent this riot and save our beloved communist dictatorship.
You guys are commies? Then why am I seeing rudimentary free markets?
If we can just get to the Delta Airlines Gold Medallion Lounge, they can't get in without spending frequent flyer miles.
Plus, we get free apple, orange, and grapefruit juice. I'm afraid that juice is not on your tongue just yet.
Broadcast of the Olympic opening ceremonies from Beijing. Thousands of Chinese performers play ancient Chinese drums. The precision of their movements made even more impressive by their massive numbers.
No! Chinese, no! Somebody has to stop them! Eric, sweetie, are you having nightmares about the Chinese again? Sweetie, are you all right? Man, the Chinese are gonna get me! No, sweetie, the Chinese aren't going to get you. They are so! There's 2 billion of them and their economy is getting better, and with their advances in technology, they're going to bring down America! There you are, Butters!
Eric!
Butters, I need your help.
Not now, Eric. I'm indecent.
The Chinese are going to take us over, Butters! And we are the only people who seem to care.
The Chinese?
I handed out flyers, called together meetings, but it's like everyone's turning a blind eye. Chinese are taking over the world and nobody's doing anything. It's up to you and me, Butters. We have to stop the Chinese now.
I can't stop the Chinese tonight, Eric. I'm supposed to make a model call with my dad.
You don't get it, Butters! Our lives are about to change. The Chinese outnumber us 1,000,000 to 1. And when their army gets here, they're going to kill your parents.
Why are they going to kill my parents?
Because the Chinese hate Americans. That's why I've started the American Liberation Front, a group dedicated to freeing America from Chinese tyranny. Will you join me?
I don't want my parents to die.
So you'll join the American Liberation Front?
Well, sure.
You and me. We're going to be the brave little boys who fought back, Butters. We are not letting them take over our country. Fuck the Chinese.
Yeah, fuck them.
All right, Butters, we're here. Are you ready?
I'm scared, but I know my country needs me.
This is it, Butters. We have to be strong. We're taking down those goddamn Chinese right now.
Oh, we found something?
Remember when an adorable little 9-year-old little girl sang Ode to the Motherland during the opening ceremonies? She lip-synced.
Brother! How dare you! How dare China do something we do at the Super Bowl every year? The girl who sang the opening ceremony was actually not the singer of the song. She was lip-syncing. Why wouldn't you just use the little girl who actually sang the song?
The reason was for the national interest, he says. The child on camera should be flawless in image, internal feelings, and expression. The decision, he says, went as high as the Politburo.
Wow. You thought your middle school years were hard. Imagine if your government got together and decided you weren't cute. This is outrageous. genius, crushing a little girl's dream for superficiality, no matter what this kid looks like. I mean, can we see the other one in the picture? I mean, oh, God! Oh! She's hideous! Can't just throw something over her face or something!
Can't believe my grandmother actually felt me up.
Okay, so that was a very entertaining caricature of how China is represented in popular culture. Next we have Susan Jakes. Susan Jakes is editor of China File and senior fellow at Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations. From 2000 to 2007, she reported on China for Time magazine, first as a reporter and editor based in Hong Kong, and then as the magazine's Beijing correspondent. She covered a wide range of topics for Time's international and domestic editions, including student nationalism, human rights, the environment, public health, education, architecture, kung fu, North Korea's nuclear weapons, and the making of Bhutan's first feature film. Jakes was awarded the Society of Publishers in Asia's Young Journalist of the Year Award for her coverage of Chinese youth culture. In 2003, she broke the story of the Chinese government's cover-up of the SARS epidemic in Beijing, for which she received a Henry Luce Public Service Award. She speaks and writes on China for a variety of print, radio, and television outlets. So we would now like to welcome Susan Jakes.
So what I just realized after watching Stan Rosen's presentation is that really journalism matters a lot less than popular culture when it comes to perceptions. But Tara asked me if I would talk a little bit about perceptions of the foreign media in China. She pointed out that lately, because several prominent U.S. news organizations have had trouble getting visas for their journalists in China, there's been a lot of public attention on the difficulties that foreign reporters have in China, and she wanted to shift the focus a little bit. And so she asked instead whether I would talk about whether the foreign media represents China accurately, what the inconsistencies are between how China perceives itself and how it is presented in the foreign media, and then how the Chinese people feel about the U.S. press. They're all very good questions. I'm not sure I'm that well equipped, especially to answer the last one. And I also think it's kind of impossible to answer any of those questions without some reference to the restrictions on the foreign media and on China's own press that we're trying to not talk about now. So that will be part of the picture. I'm not a social scientist. I haven't conducted or even ever really seen any kind of survey research on Chinese attitudes toward the U.S. press. But these are all questions I confronted during my time working as a reporter and that I'm constantly thinking about now that I edit a publication that's solely devoted to China. So what I'm going to do is just try to answer them based more or less solely on my personal experience. I guess the first thing I would say is that with questions like this, it's really important to be clear about what's meant by a phrase like how China perceives itself or how China perceives the foreign media. China's a big place. You know, of course, there are trends in public opinion. There are officially expressed views. But in my experience, treating China as a single unified entity, which is often how the official press and sometimes government spokespeople treat it, tends to obscure more than it illuminates. So I think, you know, different Chinese groups view these questions very differently. And I should say, to the extent that I personally feel that there are shortcomings in the way that China is portrayed in the foreign media, and I'm happy to say more about what those are later. I'm actually working on something now about the 5 big myths that just persist in Chinese coverage of China, even though you could not be caught dead saying them in a graduate seminar in a place like this. But anyway, this is actually one of them. I mean, I think there's a tendency too often to treat China as much more monolithic than it is, and to treat the government as if it's this perfectly centrally controlled entity when the reality is much messier. journalists often use Beijing as a convenient shorthand for any action taken by any arm of any part of the government in China, and I think that can be misleading. So I'm going to talk about several groups and how I think they see the US media, and then I'll give some of my own observations at the end. So when I was working for Time in Beijing, on 2 separate occasions, I was approached by Chinese graduate students who were studying journalism at a university in Beijing. And they were both writing their graduate theses on Time magazine's coverage of China. And the way that you'd think this would be kind of flattering, but not so much. The way that they were doing this was, well, I should back up a little bit. This was at a moment when a professor of journalism at Tsinghua University, which is one of the best universities in the country, had popularized the notion that the U.S. media, as he put it, demonized China. And this was an idea loosely derived from Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations theory, and the idea was basically that the U.S. media were waging an ideological battle in our reporting by focusing solely on negative aspects of life in China, and that this was part of a larger effort or plot to keep China from rising and damage its efforts to gain stature on the world stage. So the students' thesis involved collecting all of the stories about China from a given period of time in Time magazine, counting them up and then dividing them into piles of negative stories, positive stories, and neutral stories, and then counting which pile had more. And unsurprisingly, they found over the 2-year period that they had studied that there were more negative stories than positive stories, at least according to their standards, and that the second year there were slightly fewer negative stories than there had been the previous year, and so they wanted to know why that was, what new strategy had Time magazine adopted in its coverage of China. So obviously there's some pretty fundamental problems with their approach. They had no control. There was no comparison to how Time magazine covered Japan or India or even the United States. They hadn't really thought that much, I don't think, about what counts as news in the US, which is generally, most of the time, crisis, conflict, scandal. That's what news is. And when they made comparisons at all, it was mostly to Chinese publications who were explicitly forbidden from reporting on many of the topics that were in the negative pile. So I also remember thinking, if they could see inside the totally arbitrary, chaotic, and unplanned way that we went about deciding what we were going to cover at Time, they would have been, pretty shocked. So, but we did end up having a pretty interesting conversation. They definitely caused me to reflect a little bit on my own reporting. And I tell this story because I think it does reflect one strain of thinking about the foreign media in China, which is held, or at least promulgated, and there are probably some reasons to think that some of the people that promulgate it don't actually believe it, but that, that the basic idea of which is that the foreign media is an instrument of US power that is trying to belittle, humiliate, pick at, and just generally misrepresent China. And I think part of this arises because in China, many media do play a role in public diplomacy. Right? Part of their goal is to try to advance what China calls soft power, which is really sort of like soft power from the top down. But I don't think it's a particularly accurate representation of what drives individual journalists or even the leadership of publications in the US that I'm familiar with. Another impression of the foreign press I encountered much more often when I was in China was much more positive, but also pretty inaccurate. This was a view held by Chinese who would come to our office almost every day in Beijing to ask for help. They had grievances that they hadn't been able to redress in the courts or in the Chinese press. Their land had been taken. They'd been victims of corruption or pollution or some form of repression. And they'd come often with piles of documents to ask if Time could write a story about their case so that the central government in Beijing would find out what was happening and come and rescue them. So they were kind of they thought of Time as like this court of last resort. Very occasionally foreign media attention does attract action on behalf of people who need it, deserve it, but this happens pretty seldom, and I think the power of foreign media to affect domestic policy is often exaggerated. It's not intended for that purpose, and I think that's rarely its effect. So one frequent visitor to Times offices, who was an environmental official from a city in Shandong who had lost his job when he refused to buy an air conditioner for his boss, who was corrupt, used to call me on a fairly regular basis and ask me if I could speak to Hu Jintao, who was then the president, on his behalf, or could I call up Xiao Bush, or Little Bush, who was our last president. He once urgently called me to report that the Prime Minister of Bulgaria was in town and suggested that maybe he would have some interest in his case. So that was an extreme manifestation of this phenomenon, but I think, you know, it generally illustrates something important about the role of the foreign press in China, namely, it's not the local press. It doesn't, and it really can't serve as a local watchdog, at least not most of the time. But because of the ways that China's own media is restricted, there is sometimes the expectation, both on the part of Chinese with grievances and sometimes in the minds of foreign reporters, that the U.S. papers ought to report on subjects Chinese media can't. And that situation, I think, can create certain kinds of distortions, although I wouldn't call them inaccuracies. I should say, first of all, that I think most foreign reporting on China, most individual stories are accurate. You know, China's a big story. Most news organizations send their top reporters to China, and the ones I have known, at least, have, you know, a high degree of professionalism and skill and energy. They generally, you know, care about China, whatever that means to them individually. You know, and they've put in a lot of years. So most of them speak Chinese well now. And the standard criticism of foreign reporters is that they tend to focus excessively on issues like human rights, censorship, corruption, inequality, ethnic tension, and other topics that cast China in a negative light and don't spend enough time reporting on things like China's progress and achievements. You know, I think on balance, if one were to actually do the comparison those students who interviewed me hadn't, we might find that there is a somewhat higher tendency to report on these subjects in China than in places where the local media reports on them freely. But I also think that negative-positive dichotomy is not a particularly useful lens, and it's certainly not a criterion I think many reporters use to decide what to write about. You know, they're after good stories, and one standard measure of a good story is the revelation of something important and hidden. So if the local media isn't reporting on it, there's more hidden stuff to heroically dredge up. I should also add that one group of people who seem to feel pretty good about foreign reporters, at least in my experience, are Chinese reporters, who are often professional, dogged, and motivated by many of the same impulses as their foreign counterparts. And you know, at least in my experience, we had a lot of good stories brought to us by Chinese reporters who wanted to put them in their own publications, but were prevented from doing so by restrictions of various kinds. And during the periods when those restrictions were lighter, because they do sort of ebb and flow for the Chinese press, the period right after the cover-up of the SARS outbreak in 2003 was one such moment. You know, then you would actually start seeing a lot of stories in the Chinese press, particularly in some of the more independent magazines, that were not really all that different from what was appearing in the foreign press, except often much better reported and much more in depth. So I sort of dispute this notion that there is such a different concept of, you know, what constitutes reporting the news. I do, however, think that our conception of news globally slants towards crisis, scandal, and conflict. And so when we read news about the U.S., which is also about scandal, conflict, and crisis, we read it against a backdrop of many layers of knowledge about the non-news aspect of life in the U.S. And I think the biggest issue with coverage of China, and really with coverage of many other places in the world, is that we read about the scandal, corruption, and conflict without nearly as much sense of the society at large. So one criticism I do have about coverage of China, and really of international news in general, is less that it's not accurate and more that it's not complete. It's not a full meal. It's one way of viewing a place with what is a generally fairly limited scope, often limited geographically. Not a lot of reporters leave Chinese cities or spend long periods of time, you know, outside of the coastal areas. So I do think there ought to be more resources and more energy put into topics and storytelling techniques that focus outside of the fields of high politics and business, which are usually the mainstays of news reporting. And there ought to be more stories that are not just about crisis, conflict, and scandal. This is not to say that people should be writing positive stories about like the bumper sorghum harvest in Hebei or something like that, but that that they ought to try to find ways to learn about and to depict life as it's lived for ordinary people. And when you say something like that, it sounds like some you're motivated by some abstract notion of fairness or social justice. That's not really what it's about. It's about understanding why things actually happen in a society, and you just don't get a full picture if you only focus on elites, or if you treat everybody who's not in power as some sort of nondescript victim, which I think actually is sometimes a problem in U.S. reporting. And the best example I can think of this phenomenon in broad strokes has to do with the way that migrant labor was portrayed during the few years that after I first came to Beijing. We're talking about like 200 to 300 million people who have left their villages in China to come to the cities and work. And most of the coverage about that, if you look at the coverage in newspapers and magazines in the early 2000s, is about poor working conditions, bad labor laws, accidents in factories, perfectly legitimate news stories. But taken together, they painted this picture of such misery that they couldn't really explain why so many people were leaving their villages and going to the factories, like if it was this bad. And it really did take a few reporters stopping and saying, hey, this is not a complete picture, and then putting in months of time living in dormitories with workers, spending time on factory floors, getting to know the people that were participating in this migration, to start having like a different account of what the motivating factors were. And one shining example of that is my friend Leslie Zhang's book Factory Girls, which was the result of 3 years of hanging out with a group of workers. Suddenly when you're in the dorm room of the factory late at night, these questions look a little bit different than they do from Beijing. So the thing is, that's not really news. You can't do it on the schedule demanded by most commercial media organizations. Leslie wound up taking a long leave to do her book. You can't really do it if you don't speak Chinese. So news reporting, I feel like, has a different set of priorities and a different kind of metabolism, and these produce a certain picture that's also an incomplete picture. When I started reporting on China, I would often come back to the U.S. and talk to educated Americans who really thought that China was not that different from North Korea. And these were people who were reading the New York Times and listening to NPR. I think a lot of that has changed in the past 10 years, and now that more Americans have more contact with China, they're a little bit better able to distinguish the news from the complete picture. But I think it could still take more work, and I think media organizations could support more long-term, open-ended reporting a lot more than they do. That's a little bit what I'm trying to work on now. And I think the internet is helping a little bit, because with things like Weibo and WeChat, these social media tools, reporters have, to some extent, more access to just public opinion in China. There's something more like a public square, although I don't think just looking at comments on social media is much of a substitute for going out and actually living with people and talking to them. But I also think as the U.S. and China draw closer in commerce and education and scholarly exchange and all these ways that they're drawing closer, foreign reporters will have a somewhat lighter burden to bear in terms of being a single source of information, and I actually think that's probably a good thing. So.
Thank you, Ms. Jakes. Next we have Ivan Rasmussen, who is a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School. He is a former lecturer at Boston College, and his focus right now is on international negotiation, conflict resolution, international organizations, and specifically East Asia. Mr. Rasmussen completed undergraduate studies at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School in 2006, and received his Master's of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from Fletcher in 2009. Mr. Rasmussen previously was a Rosenthal Fellow for the U.S. Department of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Beyond public sector experience, he has coordinated an international civic engagement program based in Zhuhai, China. He was sponsored for that project by the Gates Foundation and Duke University. His most recent academic work is in Chinese international treaty behavior, how nationalism impacts Sino-Taiwanese negotiations, and the changing politics of UN peacekeeping. So now we have Mr. Rasmussen.
All right, I'll pull up my PPT. All right, so I'll say at the onset, in terms of the theme of the panel, I am unfortunately not a reporter, so I don't have that background in media, nor do I have fantastic video clips to play for you, but hopefully I'll have some other kind of interesting things to add. But I am a budding, I would like to say budding in training social scientist, so hopefully there'll be a couple of interesting things that will stick out to you and we can talk about it in the Q&A. Before I do that, to get into my slightly pedantic mode, I think a couple of students, more than a couple of the students in the audience have had to suffer through my recitations teaching at Tufts University. Yeah, I see the movement back. I'm going to do something a little bit more interactive. I'm going to do something that I don't think is very rarely done at lectures or at any kind of conferences. I'm going to ask you all to take a second, reach into your pockets, and pull out your cell phone and turn it on. I assume you all had it turned off, right? So everybody pull out your cell phones. I don't have one. Actually, it's right over there. Go ahead. Oh, yours is actually off. Go ahead and pull them out and turn them on, right? I see quite a few iPhones out there, mobile, obviously. These are smartphones, very useful. Any of you want to, just very quickly before I get into my lecture, tell me about a couple of the apps, especially social media ones, or media reporting ones that you have on your phone? Does anybody have an example? WeChat. Ben says WeChat. Yeah, Conrad back.
BBC News.
BBC News is a good source. I have BBC News. I'm on WeChat. Weibo. Yeah. Okay. Any other ones?
QQ.
New York Times. QQ. Wow, this is a pretty Chinese dominated though. We've got WeChat, Weibo. Instagram. What?
Twitter.
Oh, I don't have that one. That sounds cool though. Okay. And any other ones? I'm missing some of the American ones. Where Skype, Twitter. Let's see, Economist,
USA Today,
Facebook. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit now. Thank you for that. And you can leave your phones on and chat with your friends if you want to, if it gets too boring. What I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about something that I think is rather provocative, which is a myth. Perhaps, I'm not sure if you'll agree with this or not, Ms. Jakes, but a myth that I think exists about the great, quote-unquote, Great Firewall. Notably, I think there's a mistake as to this entity and how it's evolved over time and what it does exactly and what its motivation or what its motivation is, and also its utility. And in fact, my final argument will bring up whether or not the firewall has changed and in what ways is it interesting. Of course, the ubiquitous kind of image we have here from the morning lecture, I think Dr. Russell had an even better one. This is the upscale of China going online. I think that even more important to this in terms of the millions of users is that second red line. The second red line there is the amount of mobile users, right? This is a leapfrog story. It's not just a story of access, it's also a story of leapfrogging. This is not just accessing the internet via your PC, your home computing device, right? But it's also using these smartphones that we all pulled out at the onset of the lecture, right? And the numbers here are really fascinating. I don't have it up here, but I can give you more statistics. 50% of those 500, now more than 600 million Chinese using the internet, 50% of them are under the age of 29. So that's it's an explicit demographic that's very, very interesting. Notably, this is depending on the range, somewhere between 36 to 50% of the population in China. So there's still this market that can continue to expand. The view we have here in the US is that this great collection of people now with information at their fingertips are being severely restricted, are hamstrung by what's called the Great Firewall. And I'm just not exactly sure if that's completely true. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. One thing to note quickly about the Great Firewall, this is from greatfire.org. It's a group that kind of monitors it. The range of, again, of websites blocked are 4,000 plus, and they go from everything from news outlets to pornography, right? It's a whole range, and in fact, it supports a whole bureaucracy. Ironically, and I think some of you in the audience who've lived in China are originally Chinese, probably know this. There's a way around the Great Firewall. This is kind of an interesting picture right here because this comes from China-U.S, one of the top cell phone carriers, and here they're talking about why VPNs are virtual private networks. Having lived the last year in Beijing, I promise you this was a vital part of my life. VPNs do get pretty aggressively attacked or throttled occasionally by the Chinese government. However, there's such a plethora of them out there. I was using Tufts library. If you just use the Tufts library VPN, you can use it very easily. And let's talk about this VPN fever. So here we've got the internet, massive numbers of Chinese using it, and in fact, in quarter 4 of 2013, this is kind of the more recent data that I can get, China is one of the top 5 countries in terms of the use of VPN at over 20% of internet users, right? So, wow, this is a little bit of a different story because here's a Great Firewall, and speaking anecdotally, many of my Chinese friends, of course, those would be peers who are technically savvy, that kind of thing, but many of them are perfectly comfortable with using VPNs and getting around the Great Firewall. So the question is, well, what are they getting around the Great Firewall to do? VPN for nothing is my argument. Even though you can get around the Great Firewall very easily, it's not really something that's where people are looking up politically sensitive material. Here's what VPN usage is and internet access in China. Look at some of the smaller ones, like here, Twitter and Facebook are just minuscule in comparison to Sino-US, Renren, which is the Facebook equivalent, Kaixin, QQ, it's lower down there, and Chinese seem to be actually accessing the internet and being able to get around this Great Firewall, but are more interested in their current goods. And in just a second, I'm going to make an argument that the Great Firewall is the very reason why people who now have these VPNs are interested less in the Twitters and the Facebook, just as you would all pull out your cell phones, and more interested in the WeChats and the Weibos of the world. Because that Great Firewall had a very explicit purpose that went beyond censorship, which was the protection of domestic industry in China. I want to talk a little bit, also say that I give it another example. I don't know if you guys have seen this one, and I'll give it, there's a couple other funny ones, but this is a Korean drama that was downloaded 40 times more in the month of March of 2011 than material with regards to the Japanese earthquake and tsunami in Japan and the crisis in Libya. So the interest level here is much more along the lines of entertainment than it is anything else. I would speculate. I don't know if you guys watch Baba Chunar. I bet you Baba Chunar, yeah, so the hands are up. I suspect Baba Chunar is probably more interesting to current students than something like Syria, right? I hate to say it. And in fact, there is this great app division that we saw at the onset of the lecture. I didn't plant all these people in the lecture to do this. You have the Great Firewall, in this case, blocking not purely sensitive material, because look, I've already shown that you can use VPN to get around it. People are not so interested. Instead, it's blocking some very important, prominent apps and social medias, the examples of which are YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. And here my argument is that, in fact, this is a story about a protection of domestic industry at much more now than it is about censorship. Students, the people who are interested in potentially politically sensitive issues, have access to VPNs, as I've shown. They're not that interested in looking it up. And so what's the point of firewall? Well, in this way to protect these. Let me give you one example. Let me talk a little bit, let's see here. I think this one got a little bit out of order. Give me 1 second. Oh, here, social networking. Here's another example. Kind of, this is reiterating the point that I'll come back to my case of Facebook, and then Google. If you look at the top 15, by Tech Rights is a fantastic website if you're interested. The top 15 social networks out there, you have Weibo, Renren, Pengyou, and this is interesting because this is March 2013. What's missing from this? WeChat's not up there, and so there's a couple other ones that aren't up there. But you see, these are the kind of social network communications that are so hot and popular in China and being used by, I would argue, certainly having been through both rural and urban China, not just those in urban locations, but also rural ones. Okay, so let me talk about no more Facebook, right? The Chinese relationship with Facebook, both societal and otherwise, is a complex one. I don't know if you recognize this, but this is Wen Zhao's Facebook page, which during the 2008 Sichuan earthquake got so many likes because he went down there and he was helping spearhead this effort to deal with reconstruction and saving tons of people. And so you go from having a Chinese official. And this is in 2008, and a kind of Facebook easily accessed in China. Today, there's some debate. It's pretty much not accessible. You can occasionally get it in certain places. You can get it in Hong Kong, but not mainland China, right? To today, right? Here we're looking at countries, and if I'm China, I'm feeling a little bit anxious because right now my peers who are also blocking these major social media from the United States include Iran and Pakistan and North Korea. Turkey, I guess, was not as bad of a story. But what happened exactly? Some of you might know, in 2009, Facebook was shut down. And in July of 2009, the reason that is usually speculated by people who are in media or academics is shut down because Xinjiang Uyghur, what were considered by the Chinese government terrorists, were using this social network to reach out. I have a slightly alternative story here because it turns out that these kinds of social media can be used by a lot of different people at different times. Rebecca McKinnon at Harvard says, well, actually, the Chinese government can't monitor the WeChats of the world quite as well as you think that it can, and therefore you can still network. So wait 1 second. If Facebook is just one means of facilitating relationships, what actually happened? Well, ironically, and I think the timing is rather apt. July 2009, Facebook turned off from China through the Great FireWall. August 2009. There's a little company out of Chaoyang district in Beijing that switches its name from Xiaonei Renren to just Renren, and within 2 years after that, has an IPO that's just skyrocketing, right? Initial public offering. So my argument is the story of Facebook is not just a story of censorship of material, but it's a story of protecting domestic industry. For each one of those media opportunities are these kind of these major websites that come from the West or the U.S., Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. There's a corresponding Chinese version that I think that in this way the government, of course, I don't have direct evidence of this by telling they're not, government officials are not going to talk to me about this, but the government would want to protect. And in fact, I think the story of the Great Firewall has shifted from being about censorship, when people can get around it very easily, to being much more about protecting these domestic industries and also, to some degree, some societal issues. What happened? I already explained that. Google also is another example. For those of you, I have several friends who worked at Google, so I can talk about it ad nauseum, because every single time we go out for dinner, they would complain endlessly about how Google's being throttled, and you can't use Gmail in China, especially in Beijing. So Google has a lot of troubles there. I think the second element of this story, beyond the one of protecting domestic industry, is one of an ongoing, and in this way there's some indigeneity in the issue, ongoing tensions between those people who are managing these social networking, are internet companies, right? Notably, I think there's some strong tensions between Google and the Chinese government. And notably, the advantage also of having your own domestic industry is you can control that behavior a little bit more, versus Google is less interested in the potential of privacy issues and so forth and so on. So, what does this all mean? I'm going to try and add up a few different kind of things in this, what I would consider to be a thought piece type discussion. First, I would say that I don't think censorship is the only motivator for the Great Firewall. For its initial creation, I would say yes, and this is not to say that I'm sympathetic to it in any degree, but there is some way to be understandable of if you view the Communist Party as acting out of self-interest, but also out of concern as a group that is not very good at planning, but very good at reacting to what things come about. You have the internet arrive, and you get anxious about it, right? And so my argument is that censorship is not the only, and in fact, it's decreased significantly over time with the efficacy and the usefulness of VPNs, which are now totally widespread in China. In fact, I think that the Great Firewall now serves the purpose of, and has for quite a while, protecting national companies, right? Renren, Weibo, Baidu, right? The problem with this argument now is that those companies, if we go back to the original picture of what websites Chinese people are using, these companies are now pretty strong. Although Renren's definitely been in decline, you now have WeChat can be added into this list of different apps and stuff like that. You definitely see that these companies are pretty stable now. So the argument that they need to be protected is kind of weakened a little bit. Although as long as you can kind of work through them, that's better. Finally, even if there's this possibility of VPNs and getting around to find politically sensitive material, I'm arguing that the majority of the internet use in China is geared towards entertainment, and that there still are plenty of avenues to use social networking tools to mobilize and work together, and we see that, as was mentioned during several presentations, on the high level of protest that exists in China. 300, as Dr. Eason was calling it, 300 riots per day, right? And then I add this last part about protecting societal norms. I'm going to be more in the PC category, not too many fucks in this presentation, but pornography is an interesting case here, right? I hope people all got the levels of that joke. Pornography is an interesting case because pornography is generally blocked in China. However, it's not ubiquitous, and there's a question there. If you've lost this motivation of censorship, is it really about protecting some sort of societal norms? And here there's the kind of canonical story is of this young guy who got it from rural areas, who got a computer whenever he was in university, and then it ended up like killing a bunch of friends, and the argument was he did it because he saw a bunch of pornography, and he'd slept with a prostitute, and that was being blackmailing and something like that, which makes no sense in terms of the linear argument, but it's this societal idea. Finally, I want to bring up, and hopefully this will all add together in the end, an argument that this is a tremendous and very expensive bureaucracy. So why does the Great Firewall exist? Well, there's maybe this little bit of censorship left. There's this protection of domestic industries story. There's some infighting between, or there's some fighting between Google and Facebook with the Chinese government. But lastly, there's a big bureaucracy. And this is always a problem in a country which has at least a goal or stated goal of a central or planned economy, which is your bureaucracy size really matters, and that can continue to motivate something to continue to exist for a long period of time. In contrast, if you think about it, the two of the biggest areas where China is criticized as being centralized and repressive is Great Firewall and then one-child policy. And for those of you who followed news recently, third plenum, so forth, so on, the one-child policy is going through some reforms, right? So here we've actually got an interesting example. It's not been totally destroyed, which would make sense because I think there's a strong bureaucracy supporting the one-child policy, right? These are people who have, this is your jobs, right? I think that you have an interesting parallel to the Great Firewall. And finally, I think that whenever you add this all up, people can access politically sensitive material. There's some, it'd be nice to be able to censor certain things and control societal ways, but really it's all about entertainment and, protecting domestic industries that are now stronger. I think you have one last question. Is the Great Firewall really worth it, right? Now, I don't have the ear of Xi Jinping, but if anybody knows him or, has met his daughter at Harvard or whatever, then just kind of let them know that this is my opinion. I think that there's a really relevant argument to be made that at this stage, in two ways, this is a failing situation, and I actually don't think the Great Firewall will last forever. The first way I've already mentioned is with respect to this huge bureaucracy that's a waste of money. It's just an absolute waste of money. That doesn't mean you get rid of everybody and kick all these people out of jobs. It means you got to do something creative, like with this one-child policy reform. And the second thing, and this goes back to the media and form perceptions of China. Whenever China gets criticized from outside, the top things really are things like one-child policy, the control of people, the authoritarianism. Going back to very smart people who hopefully have now more nuanced ideas about China, saying that they're worried about the very repression that they prize, right? The people who read NPR and New York Times, as Jake was mentioning. And my argument is, if you want to blow the minds of the world, and that includes everybody on the political spectrum, from right to left, everybody makes fun of China because of the Great Firewall. If you want to blow the minds of the world, China, get rid of this thing that I think is kind of useless, right? With that, I will end, and I hope you liked it.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. So our final speaker this evening is Ying Zhu. Dr. Ying Zhu is a professor in and chair of the Department of Media Culture at the City University of New York, College of Staten Island. She is the author or editor of 8 books, including 2 Billion Eyes, The Story of China's Central Television, a leading scholar on Chinese cinema and media studies. Her writings have appeared in major academic journals, books, and publications such as The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, and The Wall Street Journal. Her 2003 research monograph, Chinese Cinema During the Era of Reform, The Ingenuity of the System, is a groundbreaking book that initiated the study of Chinese cinema within the framework of political economy. Her 2008 research monograph, Television in Post-Reform China, Serial Drama, Confucian Leadership, and the Global Television Market, together with 2 volumes she co-edited, TV China and TV Drama in China, facilitated the study in Chinese television drama. She is a recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship.
Sounds like my obituary here. And the downside of being the last speaker is everybody else have taken on from they cannot rival stand. Just let the image speak for itself. And then of course we have a seasoned reporters, once upon the seasoned reporters on the ground and relating to us her experience, and we have this energetic young man who is performing, larger than life, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And then I guarantee you, I'm going to let Tara down. She was trying to get me to throw some kind of counter punch, provide a balance, the kind of diffusing some stereotype of Chinese China that's being circulated in foreign media. And I'm afraid I'm going to actually reinforce my talk is going to reinforce this stereotype. But let me actually find my talk. Here, this one? No, this is right. Okay, so I do this. Okay. So I'm going to actually talk about the foreign media perception of China within the framework of Chinese soft power. And the soft power seems to be a buzzword in the field of foreign relations. And of course, I'm not a foreign relations expert, but I do know, as a media scholar, I do know a thing or two about media perception or perception of images and how media facilitates the circulation of certain images, and mostly is based on my own observation, common sense observation. By no means research. And soft power, I think, in many ways is about perception, and particularly about how other people perceives you. It's not about how you present yourself. It's rather about how other people perceive you. And to speak of building soft power, which we constantly hear, China's building soft power, is to assume that there is a deficiency, right, in a particular culture and society's ability to rally support and bring people on board, right? And in the case of China, the kind of immediate question that comes to mind when we speak of soft power is just to ask what sort of images that China invokes. Right? And then what sorts of images have been circulating about China or the Chinese. And I will start with an anecdote dispatched from Davos. And I think I have it down there, right? Open it up already. Here? But this is not the first one. Okay, I know how to do that now. Okay. All right, this one. Okay, so back in January, right, Joseph Nye, who is the guru, the grandfather figure of soft power, spoke at a panel on U.S.-China-Europe ties at Davos, and kindly offering his 2 cents to Beijing on how to handle China's territorial dispute with Tokyo. And after he spoke, and a fellow panelist, this gentleman here, right, a Chinese real estate tycoon, Wang Jianling, was not pleased. He just wasn't pleased, and Wang did not hide his displeasure. And Wang gave Nye a stern objection. I'm quoting him. He says, "I don't think it's polite for you to have publicly picked on China. How could you do that, right? So especially when a Chinese guest is present, and therefore I would like to officially point out my objection." Right? You see, he claims that he's speaking on behalf of 1.3 Chinese people. Right. Well, the problem is that his objection does not make the 1.3 Chinese people he proposed to speak for look any too good, right? The image of China he projects is one that is historical, hyper-nationalistic, defensive, and very insecure indeed, very insecure, and can't take any criticism, right? And of course, if you read in your U.S. newspaper, you'll see the attacks against U.S. government against Obama, and all the time, right? And people don't come and say, "Oh gosh, you can't do that," right? So, as one Chinese blogger commented on a Davos episode, quote, "Besides taking order from leaders and accepting compliments from underlings, one apparently had no idea how to have a conversation with his peers," unquote. So let me go down here. How do I get back to this? Okay. This is the technology doesn't make me. Now, okay. So, mind you that Wang Jianling is not nobody. Of course, you all know, right? See, the richest man in China in last year, according to Forbes, Wang has become China's poster boy for buying his way to boost China's soft power abroad. Hi. And then there is a very rich man from China making a splash in his U.S. debut back in February. And this time, a recycling tycoon named Chen Guangbiao, which is a self-claimed most influential person of China. And how so, right? Well, his business card said so. Now, Chen, that's it. That's and Chen announced that he was to acquire and the New York Times. He was coming to buy New York Times, and he demanded that the world, especially the Americans, take him seriously. But first of all, he wants to make sure that the Americans actually know who he is, right? And as he settled into the posh Access House in New York for an interview, and he fired a series of questions throughout his interview with the reporter, this poor reporter from the New York magazine. So those are his questions. Quote, "How many Americans know that I am here in New York right now? Does President Obama knows about me? Does Obama know that I'm here in New York?" Right? And he was not being facetious. And he really thinks that the world should stop for him. And he's here, and we should pay attention. Well, he has certainly caught our attention, albeit in a way that does not make China look too good. Right? And now, as to the idea of acquiring the New York Times, what does Chen want to achieve? Right? He wants to make the Times more objective and reputable. And he wants to join the Sino-US media force. So if you can't change foreign media's coverage of China, then you just buy them up. Right? You acquire them, which partly explains China's, kind of the Chinese state's fast financial penetration in foreign media outlets, particularly in the global south. Now, but are these tactics successful? Well, the Pew Research says no. Chinese Taiping's global shopping spree has so far failed to capture the hearts and minds of at least, these people who managed to get into the Pew Research, right? And of course, the persistent headline stories around the world about a cluster of rights-related issues do not make China look good. And what about economic incentives then? Since everybody wants to have a piece of China's market, nobody wants to miss the China bowl. Well, economic carrots and sticks can only carry you so far. Economic incentives brings about strategic partners, which is a common, policy in international relations, but not mutual admiration. So let's don't confuse hard currency with soft power. So China's upheaval battle on the image front, I'm afraid, continues. And I'm not probably as upbeat as some of you here. Now, so what can China do? Well, perhaps resurrecting the panda diplomacy of the Nixon era. And I wanted to just give you a breather, have a little moment to enjoy these cute pandas. And they're really charming. And of course, he's Jon Stewart's favorite.
You're going to escape. He's going over the fence. What happens when he hits the ground on the other side? He's almost out. She's not paying attention. He's got to get out. Oh. Get back in there, you. Hands under. These two are wrestling with the plastic box. Going right back for it. Look at him. He does not want to be in that cage. He is ready for the adult world. Here he goes.
I'm afraid I have to turn down the volume. You can continue to watch this, but I do have to continue on. Okay, yes, that's muted. Yes, you can see it without listening to the commentary. But back to this serious question. The question is, can China sway the perception of foreign media? Right. Yes, to a degree. I have to kill it, otherwise nobody's paying attention to me. Okay, so what's the question? The question is, can China sway the perception of foreign media? Yes, to a degree, but not without changes to the way the Chinese state conducts its business of governing. That's, my view. It would be wise for the Chinese state to allow for some alternative culture to emerge that would project a China that is hip and knows how to have fun. Much like the K-pop wave inspired by the Gangnam style, which I don't have time. I was going to show you the Gangnam style, but I don't have time for that. So, but let me get back to the slide. Here it is. I'm getting a better handle. Okay, here's the Gangnam style. You know what that is, so there's no need for me to show you. So what the South Koreans have accomplished via this funky music video is what the Chinese state has been craving for, but denied so far. Now, the lack of recognition or desirability of Chinese soft power is not due to lack of trying, as billions, we're talking about 8.2 billion a few years ago, have been spent in China's global image lifting campaign. Yet the overall international image of China continues to be, to put it mildly, not too cool, right? Now, China can certainly produce its own brand of soft power, fusing cultures high and low, but whatever it produces, it has to really resonate with the grassroots and are capable of unleashing individual creativity. Paternalistic political and cultural surveillance and control just don't work, right? Especially in this day and age. And mind you, which while left to their own device, the Chinese are actually capable of producing its own brand of popular culture sensation that's so cute, cuter than the baby pandas. I'm going to show you. I think that some of you have seen this.
大家好，我叫张志好，我今年3岁了，我来自山东淄博，这是我的宝贝，我要和我的宝贝一起表演节目。
你一个人表演吗？
我和我的宝贝一起表演随便跳。
I have to fast forward because I know we don't have time to get to the real. Okay, when he starts to 随便跳。
你拉的那个。
I have to fast forward a little bit. Sorry. It's coming. It's coming.
哦，这还真有意思，是有遥控器，那是音箱啊。
How do I get to the keyboard?
That little guy.
It's Japanese. Oh, I'm sorry. You just have to watch it when you are when the thing is over. But see, the Chinese people are capable of producing, real hip and sensation. And I hope this rivals Professor Stanley Rosen. A lot of you will be amazed. You will be amazed. But that's a good point. It's a good point. But you'll be amazed. You know who gave this to me? My daughter. It's quite a little bit. But it's been very, very popular among the high school American students, much like the K-pop, right? It was a sensation among the high school students.
I saw it.
So the point I want to make is, what China needs to do is to really loosen up its control of media and pop culture so that information channels are open to diversity and competition and even perhaps dissent, right? And that is the sort of confident image that the world can embrace and that foreign media might actually endorse. So ultimately, to quickly wrap it up, what needs to be fixed is not just China's draconian state image alone. For China's charm fence to work, soft power charm fence to work, so far as foreign media perception is concerned, China will really need to have the confidence. The Chinese state will need to have the confidence to tolerate dissent and to let 100 flowers blossom. So less control and more freedom would be my prescription for boosting China's soft power, for make the money worth spending. That's what it is. I hope it's entertaining now.
Okay, so I think we will try to fit on this table now so that we can open it up for Q&A. Yeah, sure. So, the first one is, do any of you have any comments?
I had some ideas, but now they're gone, so the vote was working.
Well, I guess I just thought, I was just listening to Ying's presentation, thinking about your presentation. It's interesting to see, and this actually, you said, just kind of the role that China's economic strength is and isn't playing in this sphere? Because it certainly, from your account, it certainly sounds like the fact that there's this huge market in China that Hollywood needs really is actually affecting the content of Hollywood-produced films, and does seem to be blunting some of the blunting some of the indictments of the kinds of things that Ying was talking about. So I guess it would just be interesting to hear the two of you kind of discuss how you see those forces playing in your respective fields.
I was just thinking this is important.
Oh no.
I was thinking it's interesting because the U.S. is essentially is a collage and collection of images from film, film images. And I think as I also wrote about this, Hollywood's changing relationship with the Chinese film industry, and the changing relationship with Chinese film market. Of course, the Chinese Hollywood is a business, right? So it does buy into this economic logic. Right? In many ways, fundamentally, it's about going into the Chinese market, conquer that market, and how do you do that? You cannot offend audiences in China. You cannot offend the censors in China. So what you see there is a lot of it really is the economic imperative. So what I covered is really this is different. The print media, the social media, they operate in different kind of logic. And I just quickly comment on. I don't know if you. Actually, in 2009, I made a documentary about. It's about Google's aborted China venture, and it's called Google versus China. And I actually touched on a lot of similar issues that you mentioned. I must say though, you have to tell me where you live in the Beijing, because I'm not going to follow you. Stay where you are, because where I stay in Beijing, China, it was just very difficult to bypass. Yes, so it's probably because I'm not as as you are. Not believe that.
I don't know where to last there, but I think to quick one though, to my question for Stan, this I think builds off what Mr. Rosen was saying. Is there a difference between TV and movies? Because as you just said, movies have to appeal to this audience, right? And it seems like whenever we're just watching, there's a bit of selection bias because, very satirical TV series. Yeah, you're limited to 12 minutes. But like, I guess my question is that TV series, it seems as though, especially the satirical ones, can be a little bit ruder versus movies. Yeah. So I'm wondering if it's differentiable. Do we see it actually? I don't know. Is there even a rhyme or reason to it? And one of the things that I'm thinking about on both sides, House of Cards, we were just mentioning, quite popular in China, despite having a negative image of China. Right?
We're talking about that too. And you was written on that too. She and I disagreed at the AS. But a couple of, am I ready?
Can you guys hear, by the way?
Yeah,
I can speak up a little bit.
Okay, I'm going to speak up. Okay, I had a couple of comments out of it. Some anyway. Soft power issues. House of Cards is an interesting case. And of course, Julian's headline was not her headline in that article, I understand. What? Somebody's headline. But he said it's a great victory for China, House of Cards. And so I took issue with that AS meeting. But there's a real question, a couple of things about soft power. One is House of Cards, there's that great scene when for those, I don't know, not spoiling for anybody, but at the beginning of season 2, when Kevin Spacey, Frank Underwood, becomes vice president, he talks to the camera, as he often does, and says, I'm a heartbeat away from the presidency, and I didn't even get a single vote. Democracy is so overrated. Now that sounds like it could have been written in Junanhai. At the same time, though, you look at the Weibo accounts, and people say, how could the American Ministry of Propaganda have allowed the show to be on the air? The implication is there is no Ministry of Propaganda. That's why it's on the air. So who is it? And the Chinese government has allowed that show to be shown without censorship by and large because they think, as Cui Genkai has been quoted and even wrote about it, and Wang Qishan as well, who watches it, saying this shows how corrupt the American political system is. So from the Chinese point of view, they're taking this as if this is actually how American politics work. But people on Weibo certainly and WeChat make a very different argument. And Kurt Campbell, Secretary of State, basically said this is actually more how Chinese politics works. And that's why it's so popular in China, because it's really the Bo-Xilai case.
Susan and I worked together for that piece. And Chinese, and I know that a lot of people in China are really not just in Taiwan. I think that we really did touch on the point. These are the points. The very fact that yes, a show that's highly critical of the United States and is allowed to be made. But such a show has yet to emerge in China. And also in the point about transformation of political, the sentiment about politics in general, right? And only a decade ago you have Westwood, which is a highly idealistic look at politics, right? And then now you have this, essentially what I call the House of Cards is the Chinese officialdom, Chinese officialdom drama. So that's sort of, this is, I totally agree with you.
They should like Veep as well. I don't know if they touch that.
That would be a bit too.
Here's an interesting one. I just want to push back a little bit on this assumption that the Chinese censors have this level of control. I don't think they have that much level of control, unfortunately. Maybe it's just because, but why, in contrast to House of Cards, why would they cancel Django Unchained after it had already been showed initially in the middle of showing in southern China, which is a highly critical thing about the U.S. So I just don't see rhyme and reason to the
this is the problem.
control.
You raise an interesting point because you look at a movie like Less Caution, and I spoke to Sun Dai about that as well. Because, he was involved in getting it released in China. It was pulled from theaters after a while. How anybody could have thought Less Caution would be suitable? Now I've written about this, so I don't want to go into great detail, but they've tried to win over Ang Lee after they really screwed up with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which ended up as a Taiwan victory. They're desperate to win an Academy Award. Ang Lee is the only one who can win an Academy Award. So they placated. I was at the Shanghai Film Festival in 2006 when Ang Lee was there. He just finished being Less Caution. I was talking about it, and they're really trying to how really as much as possible. So they allowed the recent film in theaters with some scenes cut. But after a while, people realized, well, this is anti-patriotic. How can we show this film? Django Unchained, somebody made the decision to put it in theaters, and somebody higher up said, you're crazy. And it was removed very quickly. So I would say that it's not necessarily less censorship, but a battle over censorship. The most recent case is Oliver Stone at the Beijing International Film Festival just recently, where he said, and this is a panel with Zhang Shun, chair of co-production, the head of co-production in China. And he talked about how you can never have a co-production that works in China. Because, for example, you can't make a movie critical of Mao Zedong. And Oliver Stone, going back many years, has tried to make a film about either Mao or Jiang Qing, Madam Mao, and has been rebuffed for a variety of reasons. So he probably went forward in making this criticism, and Jiang Qing tried to cut him off, but kept going on and on. And the speculation is that he was put up to it by somebody within the government. Or certainly people like Feng Xiaogang were making the same argument for many years, that Oliver Stone is representing people in China who want to do this. But this is a very common thing. One last point about that. Years and years ago, back in 1987, when I was at the Zhejiang Academy of Social Sciences, the vice president of the academy, who I knew very well, said, we have the 12th, I think the 13th Congress, 87, I think the 13th Congress is coming up. We want you to give a talk about that. There'll be a lot of public security people, military people, party people there. We want you to raise issues which we cannot raise. But once you raise those issues, we can then have a Q&A, and we can raise issues using the foreign to serve other purposes. So it's lots of things, as Susan said, it's not on Olympics. There's a lot of stuff going on in China. And there are people who do want all this great censorship, and others who say no. And they're fighting all the time.
Okay, just to make sure that the audience gets their questions.
Yeah, I haven't even started yet.
So we'll come back to it if we have time, but just to make sure that the audience gets their questions out. If you have questions, please maybe raise your hand and state your name and affiliation. And please try to keep your questions short. So, Dr. Austin.
Thanks, Tara. So I enjoyed everybody's presentations, and I'm glad I stayed for it. Ivan, I think that the argument that you make, the conclusion you reach is the right conclusion. That wasn't persuaded by your arguments. You know, that I think that you've got to put alongside the information that you're presenting with what's happening in real life from security services. Who are they? What are they watching on the internet? What are the consequences of what they're watching on the internet, and who are they taking down? And that's got a lot worse. But I think China's at a tipping point, and I think stands under something where he talks about, you know, a debate over censorship. People who want less are not winning. But I think there is a bit of a tipping point. But for the reasons that more or less I think Ying Zhu alluded to as well, this is very expensive. It's not producing what it's supposed to be producing. It's not producing security. It's not producing development. It's producing insecurity. So at some point they're going to ask the question, and the related point is this one about the increase in the public security budget, now 3 to 4 times the military budget. This US reporters can't quite get right. They seem to say that it's consistently that it's more expenditure on internal security forces than on the military. It's not, it's more expenditure on internal security activities, which include this great army of censors in the government and all of the co-opted censors. But I think you've got a really interesting conclusion. I'd like to see how you add to it, you know, what's happening in the takedowns and who's going to jail and being put away, and who's losing their job or being put in a mental hospital for what they're saying on the internet.
I'll do a quick, 2-second response to that. It's obviously a piece that needs more work to it in terms of the analytical rigor. It's also kind of a piece from my side of things. And I didn't mean to make a suggestion that the targeting of individuals, and this is one that I have a very strong connection to. I was talking previously with the panelists about this. I have a relationship with Iowa Waste Studio and stuff like that. So people are. I'm not saying people are not being targeted. What I'm saying is that this Great FireWall is not as much as we'd like to think it is in terms of letting information in. Now, controlling it once it's in, it may be a little bit more of the top of the story. So I'm sorry if I didn't put it on that.
Yeah, I just have a question for Professor Rosen. Yeah.
Can you speak up a little?
Yes, because you just put out this collage of film and videos in which there are some films that's like outright racist towards like Chinese people, and in which some of them are like kind of like exaggeration of the stereotypes that's been circulated around the society. Right. So I'm just wondering, what's your take on all these films, and like how do you, like, what do you think is like different? Like, I just want to know your opinion because you didn't say anything.
No. Well, yeah, I'm just the messenger. What I guess the basic point, aside from the ones I've already made, is that, and as Susan suggested, these are images. South Park, for example, is incredibly popular. Of course, they do this not just with China. You can see it with Church of Scientology, Jews, it's across the board. They ridicule everybody. And this is what came out in a meeting we had in 1998 in Washington, where people from China, including some of the people who wrote China Can Say No, were there. Sui Tiankai was there at the time. It was the National U.S.-China Relations, the Kennedy School at American University. It was 2 or 3 days, and it was fascinating to watch because the Chinese were basically saying, why are you demonizing China all the time? And the American people, like Bernard Kalb and others, people who were at the Pew Institute, they were saying, we don't demonize China, we demonize everybody in the American press. And the Chinese found to their surprise in the course of those meetings that President Clinton was treated much better in the Chinese press than he was in the American press. And they hadn't realized any of that. So the point I'm making, number one, is that these are TV shows which are shaping opinions. So something to be concerned about, but there's no censorship of that. I mean, South Park has basically been censored once or twice with images of Muslims after some assassinations and so on, because Comedy Central and the people behind the network were very concerned that lives were in danger, and they were very upset about that because they're making fun of even the stuff they've done on Bin Laden, when Bin Laden was alive, having sex with a camel, and a lot of insulting things. And I think one of the problems, as with what Ying was saying about Wang Jianlin, that unfortunately this happens, but I think China can be too sensitive about that kind of thing. I gave a week-long, last thing I'll say, I gave a week-long presentation at the University of Oklahoma on film, Chinese film. And I spoke to the Confucius Institute as well as Pete Grease, the center there. And the first film I showed was Li Yang's Blind Shaft. And first question I had from the audience, from a Chinese graduate student, was, do you like China? The implication being, if you're showing that film, you cannot possibly like China. Well, I invited Li Yang to come to USC. He showed the same film, he got the same question. I think there's a little bit too much sensitivity, which we don't have in the US. We're very insensitive in the United States, and I think China is overly sensitive. Something in between might work. But I don't subscribe to the South Park in terms of my own views, to say the least. I think my life study in China is obviously, I miss like China.
Yeah, Ben.
So this question's for Ivan. When I was in China, I heard another sort of use or reason for the Great Firewall that you sort of alluded to but didn't explicitly mention in your presentation, which was the use as a sort of mechanism of coercion by the government to sort of leverage what they have with companies. An example of that being the what happened with the falling out of Google. I think it was Google that the Chinese government wanted information on dissidents that Google had on their communications, and Google didn't agree, and so they kicked them out. They put them on the Great Firewall, and sort of the opposite point or path being Yahoo, which is cooperated with the government in that kind of area. So I was wondering if your experience, you've seen that that's sort of a legitimate use. You sort of debunked it as a censorship mechanism, but in terms of like a coercive mechanism, it's something that wouldn't exist without the Great Firewall.
Absolutely. So I think it definitely is. And the interesting question now is not just can it be something that's directed outwards, can it be something that's directed inwards to companies? If you had a movement of this, whatever this non-censorship group was within, let's say, more opening up along in Britain or something like that, would you see that? Would you see an interest in or in some way, some sort of leverage saying, hey, we're going to open up the Great Firewall, Facebook's coming in, you guys got to toe the line. So it works both ways, not just in terms of keeping certain groups out, but also in terms of leverage of controlling groups within.
One point I would just make about VPNs and then also these new hosting services on Amazon that are used by groups like Great FireWall to post things that have been censored in China is like the interesting thing about those is Chinese government might want to choose to control those things. It's not like they don't have like the technical capacity to but they actually have an active business interest in maintaining those kinds of technologies. So this is another area where like the economic interests and the free speech issues collide a little bit. Companies use VPNs for purposes other than accessing websites. But I also think on the flip side, it did make a big difference. I mean, if you look at what's happened with Bloomberg News over the past few months, it really did make a big difference when the Great Firewall began to block the Bloomberg website. That caused a whole cascade of decisions within Bloomberg about both their news coverage and their business strategy, and then their overall media strategy. And that was, it partly has to do with the fact that Bloomberg has other business in China that they didn't want to disrupt. But I guess I just think there are still some important censorship functions in the Great Firewall that you don't want to totally discount.
Yeah, I agree. It's significant. And they achieved the goal too. And you also want to think about too is, so what is the purpose of the Great Firewall? So what are the targeting users? Who are the targeting users? Of course, they're not targeting at these affluent, well-educated, white-collar users. We can easily climb the Great Firewall, and that's not a concern. Right? So the Chinese government, I think there are some of the panelists who they're very concerned about the masses. They're concerned about accessing information from a larger audience, larger readers. So that's the real purpose of blocking, certain sites. Of course, we cannot block nuts. And then also the other thing,
you have to know what you want to find if you're
That's the problem. Is if it's not working. If there's so many. I don't really. Okay, never mind.
If you don't know what you're looking, I mean, if you know what that blocked website you're trying to get to, sure, a VPN is great. But if you're just doing a Google search on something, or I mean, you're doing a Baidu search, and certain search results don't turn up.
Yeah.
You don't even know they exist. That's exactly the point.
I'm interested if there's any statistics in China about how many people are using the VPN, because it is actually really expensive. It tends to be getting here for free, but it is pretty expensive.
Yeah, it's so it was in the thing, but the 20% of Chinese internet users were using in 1 quarter, which is a lot. We're talking 20% of 600 million. So I'm not good at math. But the answer is a lot.
There's room to question the 600 million and the higher figures because more than one person has.
Yeah. So it might be more flexible. And then your question about the price level, I haven't sourced out what that is. You're right, it can be kind of expensive, but I think the plethora of VPNs that are out there will really surprise you. We're talking about like hundreds of different services, and they can be cheap. So
yeah, they're very impressed by that.
Yeah.
But I personally use the VPN in Shanghai, so it cost me about $30 for half a year.
Half a year, $30 right here, which is pretty expensive.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm a professor from the Law Street, and I have a question for Professor Zhu. So you were talking about like the soft power notion, and I was just wondering, like, we were making the analogy between Chinese soft power and Korean Gangnam Style. It's like Gangnam Style is actually just by one entertainment company. You cannot compete with like the American soft power notion of democracy. Because Joseph actually pointed out that after 1989, the Tiananmen massacre, and that lots of Chinese people were pro-US just because of this notion of democracy, which was what we were looking for. So what do you like? If you were making this analogy between K-pop and Chinese fusion soft power, how would you compete that with like the other notions that other countries can have?
I don't think I'm making an analogy between the K-pop and Chinese soft power. Basically, the gist of my talk is really about. I try to control my impulse to be even more critical, and I sort of tone it down and just focusing exclusively on public culture. So what I said essentially is, if you change the kind of paternalistic control, the kind of impulse and control, then you might be able to unleash some grassroots creativity, and that you let something that's as funky as this K-pop can appear. And then I quoted one example, that the boy is right, and that's the kind of soft power that you can have. But of course, I'm not really talking about the issue. I touched upon the rights of the issue, but not everything else. That's not this particular talk. But certainly that's been something I've been written about. I've been writing about.
I'll just say a couple of quick things. One, if you want, Robert Kane, who has a blog, he's done a piece on why is South Korean soft power so much more successful than Chinese soft power. He has 5 basic reasons, and I would call your attention to that. I can send it to you if you read it. It has to do with the kind of training in school, censorship issues, a certain part of it, and so on. You take something like the recent 来自星星的你 with the My Lover from Another Star, or something like that, which is very popular in China, so much so that it shows you the power of soft power. That because the star is eating all this fried chicken and beer, people died in China by eating too much of it. But it was a major issue of discussion at the Zhengxie, the People's Book Consultative Conference, where one of the delegates said, this is an attack on Chinese culture. How dare they steal Chinese food, same way they did with Kung Fu Panda at one point. But Wang Qishan, actually, who also talked about it, the Standing Committee Politburo, said what South Korea is doing is all about Chinese culture. They're promoting our culture for us. We should be able to do it ourselves, but we have to rely on South Korea or the United States to do it. And the question is, how can China promote its own soft culture?
That's interesting. One thing I didn't say, I actually gave similar talk also, but I didn't touch upon it a little bit more in depth because of time constraint. And this is fundamentally it is about the issue of censorship. Let me just use a very crude example here. So the Korean K-pop, the Gangnam Style, was made enormously popular because YouTube is banned in China. You see the irony. YouTube is banned in China. The very channel that you can utilize doesn't exist. It's not available to you. And so this is, and by the way, and this might come as a joke here. So the Korean government actually gave Google an award for really populating the Gangnam Style video. I mean, literally giving Google an award. And so there is actually a very highly orchestrated soft power campaign within the Korean government and then the culture administration.
Well, the Chinese have their own version of Gangnam Style with the ethnic taking off, and this is very popular in China. But how many people outside China will ever see it? That's the issue of YouTube.
Okay, so in the interest of time, we'll take one last question. Yeah.
It's fine. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, me? All right. I'm Hiram. I'm a Tufts student. Thank you all for speaking. Professor Rosen, I was glad you mentioned House of Cards because I think it lays a nice foundation for my question, which is for all of you. I've read a couple of studies that seem to corroborate some of what you're saying. That the second season of the show received more views in China than the first season, and a lot of people have described its popularity to its portrayal of systemic corruption on the U.S. side and not portraying the Chinese leadership as a single, unified, monolithic entity. Rather, they're competing forces across a variety of sectors, so telecom, for example, in the show. But I'm wondering how much more we can expect in journalism or in entertainment to see that sort of portrayal, and how ready the U.S. public that doesn't focus on China and study a lot of China, how ready they might be to adopt that more sophisticated view of the Chinese leadership.
First of all, I'll let other people answer it basically, but I would say even if people don't focus on China, you can ask anybody on the street when China is mentioned, what comes to mind. And some people might say pandas, some people might say food, some people might say, I don't know. A lot of people still think Mao Zedong is the leader of China in the U.S. So it's hard to know, but I think people do have an image of China. You can see from some of these shows, they do watch things like South Park, they watch the Daily Show, and they certainly watch The Simpsons. So with that little line about Tibet, Tibet seems to be pretty independent. How'd that work out? So people have those images of China, and so they can buy into something like House of Cards. Again, people who watch a Netflix show, people who watch House of Cards in general are going to be pretty sophisticated in terms of who's actually watching it. It's not American Idol, for example. So they already have some knowledge and have an interest in politics, so they'll know something. But the level, one last point, the level of knowledge in the U.S. is not high. I always tell my class, there's a survey done by Time Magazine, as I remember, in the Washington Post, back in the mid-'80s, late '80s, in which they asked who were the three most prominent Japanese, living or dead. Well, number one was Hirohito, no surprise, former emperor. But number two was Bruce Lee, who was not Japanese, obviously. And number three was Godzilla. There's very good person. And there are a lot of other things in that survey about that we didn't know where Vietnam was or the Pacific Ocean, things like that.
Well, just quickly, I do think that I think you're right. You know, the majority of the European audiences, Western audiences, China is still somewhat out there. It's a very old notion of China and Chinese. But I think shows such as a House of Cards, I think in many ways actually does help to build, as I said in the piece, build China's soft power in a way that it tries to really give a little more complexity into this kind of monolithic version of China. But I do want to say, do you notice one thing that's missing about China in the House of Cards? It's corruption, it's princeling, it has, you name it, sex and whatever, right? So what's missing? That will become an issue that will incur censorship. It does not mention one word of human rights. Remember West Wing only a decade ago, right? Human rights is a recurring theme. Right? You have this idealistic, pompous president, right, on the forefront fighting for the better of humanity, constantly coming up with issues. The third world country has human rights issue, that one has it. But this particular issue is completely missing in House of Cards, which explains why the Chinese state really get forward in this show.
Okay, so we've reached the end of our time, and Donald will overrun. I know that Ivan needs to go. So we're going to end here. Thank you all for coming.
Don't go there.
If you have any lingering questions, you're welcome to come down and talk to them. Thank you.
Before you leave, we have the closing remarks for the symposium, and I think it'll be like 5 minutes, so you have a moment.
Okay. Thank you to all the speakers for their insightful comments. Please join me and give them another round of applause. My name is Wen Yi, and I'm on the programming team for this year's China-U.S. Symposium. It is a great honor for me to speak here and make this closing remarks. We have come to the end of the 7th annual China-U.S. Symposium. The past 2 days have been full of inspiration. Our symposium began with an address by Assistant Secretary Daniel Russell, who spoke about the imminent challenges and immeasurable gains the United States, China, and the rest of the world will experience as China becomes a superpower and the United States pivots towards Asia. Our panel on Friday further delved into the topics, detailing President Obama's foreign policy towards Asia, and the triangulating relation between the United States, China, and Africa, from the perspective of all 3 regions. Today's panel, Military and Cyber, and Foreign Media Perception, cover both of the military and media sector and the increasing role that both of them play in global relationships. Overall, we cover a wide variety of topics, delving into many of the most important intricacies in the ever-changing relationships. Before we depart, I would like to offer some final words on our symposium theme this year, engagement. To the best of my knowledge, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, events like the China-U.S. Symposium didn't really happen. Students rarely worked together to bring speakers to their schools for academic symposiums. Not to mention bringing speakers from around the world for a symposium on the most important issue regarding relations between the United States and China. In other words, the current generation of leaders in office growing up and learn how to forge relationships and shape policy in an environment without the type of engagement we have now. This is a key and perhaps the final and most important conception of engagement with which we may leave here today. The environment in which my generation has had the opportunity to learn and thrive is worlds apart from that of any other era. It is not possible for us, as students, to come together to bring 20 speakers, professors, government officials, and professionals together to talk to us about international issues. What does that say for us as a generation of leader? For me, it says that we will be the most educated, the most interconnected, the most communicative, the most informed, and the most engaged generation. Engaged in communication, collaboration, and cooperation with government and people around the world. Engaged in solving our greatest problems alongside other nations rather than in spite of them. Engaged not only with issues relating to our own country, but with those of the entire world. Through events like this, we can actually begin to understand the world long before we ever take office. This is unprecedented and outstanding. And we have many people to thank for the success of the symposium. First, I would like to thank all audience members for your support and participation, who, by giving their time and their voice, made our effort meaningful. Second, I would like to thank our 2014 China-U.S. Symposium team for the excellent work we have been done in the past 8 months of calling, planning, and organizing. This is a 100% team effort, and what we have accomplished today would not be possible without everyone's commitment and perseverance. I would also like to thank Tufts University and the Tufts Institute for Global Leadership for giving us the platform on which our many speakers could discuss and share their perspective with a young, passionate audience. And finally, the greatest thanks of all goes to our speakers, who, with their time and their passion and their perspective, now led us down a road of enlightened leadership that will allow us to change the world for the better. I hope you all have enjoyed your stay in Boston at the Tufts. I wish you a safe journey home. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, she said yes.